Welcome, everyone. We're really excited to have you here today to talk about five generations in the workplace. And as a quick introduction to myself, I'm Ryan Tahmassebi. I'm the People Science Director at WorkBuzz, which is just a fancy job title, a way of saying I'm an occupational psychologist. I spent the last 15 years or so exploring employee engagement, employee experience, and culture in the workplace. So to be here and joined by Rebecca Robbins is fantastic so that we can really talk about how the different generations are experiencing work, shifting attitudes, shifting mindsets, but ultimately try and help yourselves as practitioners navigate this really challenging but ever-present question of how do we unlock the potential of a multi-generational workforce. So delighted to have you here today, Rebecca. I'm going to put the pressure on you and say you are the true expert in this field. So if you would like to just give yourself an introduction to the audience that we have here today and tell them a little bit about the book and what inspired your work and your thinking and your research on multi-generations.
Oh, thank you so much, Ryan. And likewise, delighted to be here. Always love working with yourself and the WorkBuzz team. I think precisely because of what you just touched on and the sense of, the community that we have on the call today and, just looking at everyone who signed up for this and the breadth and depth of roles, expertise, experience, representation across industries, different organizations is just mind-blowing, and mind-blowing in the sense of, I think, this word potential, because if we are led to believe some of the narratives from media and marketing that have really proliferated over the past 2 to 3 years, especially, we're really under-indexing on a moment in time, which won't come again, in the sense that, we are at this turning point when, for the first time in history, we are, either already at that point where we have five generations in our workplaces, and of course, with our consumers, clients, and customers, or we're on the cusp of that. And of course, that's true as we are living for longer and therefore shall want and need to work for longer. I think one of the things that really excites me about these conversations, because I work at the intersection of things. So I work across brand, culture, leadership. I'm a big believer in how we also accelerate talent through the business. And I know a lot of people have those roles on the call today. And I guess the final piece is the author piece to what I do is important, because this is my third book, but it very much feels as though this is helping me answer the question, how will I have been part of the solution? As I was reflecting through my own generational lens, what will I have contributed to all the problems, to all the latent opportunity that we have when we think across business, society, and there's so many force factors that I'm sure with everyone on this call, we feel there's so much that is out of our control. At the same time, we're here in 2025. Surely there is more that we can do if we join the dots a little bit better around how we can lean into a moment that, frankly, the evidence, and I'm so heartened by the evidence of the research that I've done over the past years, has shown there is so much potential if we choose to unlock it. So hopefully that sets a little bit of the tone for the session. I always love this cover image, by the way, Ryan. It's a fantastic one. So I think sets the tone for, crucially again, what we do together. So the important thing here, as I said, we have five generations at work for the first time in history. And so I say "and" because this is context. It's a fact. It's a human truth. What excites me far more, and this is what took me down the rabbit hole of quant research across 4 continents and over the course of just over 5 years, was the premise of, surely there is something more positive, pragmatic, that is going to hardwire into how we do better business. So really, for me, the subtitle of the book is probably the most important. It's how we win together for good. I'm sure everyone on this call today, there is so much that we achieve as individuals, that we're responsible for as individuals, and that motivates us, that gives us our own reward and satisfaction. At the same time, we all know we have to do this together, whether that's through our teams, our business units, across the entire organization, not least as we start to think about with partners and stakeholders and wider collaborators. The feel good piece, I think I just want to sort of dwell on for a second, in 2 respects, because for me also this has to be about more optimistic and joyful outcomes in terms of how we look at work. We've been through COVID. Let's hope we're not in that situation again, at least for a very long time. We've been through constraints of recessions. We're going through a plurality of dynamics right now. But in the time that we have on this planet, when we think about we're living for longer, what will our contribution have been? And so my mission was also to infuse a bit more sense of, can we have a bit of a reset where we need it sometimes in our own organizations? And I think this is where I love working with people officers, with heads of learning and learning engagement partners and HR partners, and this entire melting pot of what, frankly, I think is the most exciting catalyst for change, for impact and influence in organizations, to really be the voices within organizations and to really elevate our mission. Because the second part of For Good is also in the sense of doing fewer things well and sustaining them. I know through the work that I do with a huge breadth and depth of the people community across the world, so much has come onto the HR and people remit and responsibility plate. It is frankly unbelievable. It's believable in one sense because, of course, there's so much that we do, but at the same time, when is too much too much? Absolutely everything is on that plate right now, and a lot of what I hear and what was evidenced in the research in the book, and we can touch on that as well, is that there's almost this overload of so much happening within organizations right now, often for good intent. And I think there's an opportunity, and I see and hear it loud and clear within the community on this call, is that, how do we best sort of say no? How do we best interrogate the why when new initiatives come our way? And how can we be, again, those architects and catalysts for doing fewer things well and sustaining them? And of course, when it gets into the work that you do, Ryan, the work we've been talking about is how do we best pulse that through the organization so we've got a better lens on what's informing what we're doing and why.
So quick question to you, Rebecca,
please.
there on that, and this, throughout this next 50 minutes or so, we've got lots of questions that we want to ask the audience and kind of get their input as well. And please, to those of you who are with us, if there are any questions that you've got throughout as you're hearing Rebecca and I talking, please do feel free to use the chat box. And the first one I would love to hear a bit from the audience on as well, and yourself, Rebecca, is that point that you mentioned around almost changing the narrative, being more optimistic and talking more about opportunity. I would love to know whether our audience here and yourself, with the work that you do with organizations, are you feeling like the mood around the conversation with regards to generations is more about barriers and blockers and challenging negative perceptions? Or is it about optimism and the great opportunity that we have in front of us to unlock potential with this particular workforce? And I've got my views and kind of what I see in here, but I'd love to hear from yourself, Rebecca, and our audience as to whether you feel it's a positive framed conversation or actually it's more negative at this moment in time.
Well, I'm happy to give a very short response, simply because, again, like you, we, as Ryan said, we very much want this to be interactive, and we promise you it will be, because we've got a whole host of questions and polls bedded into the content, and we're about to get into that. But I think the short answer is, I'm a pragmatic optimist by nature, so that has always been the case. But aside from that, what I've seen, and again, this is not only in the research in the book up to publication, which was towards the end of last year, but I think there's certainly a groundswell in the organizations that I work with, but also what I see in social media conversations, online, offline, that sense of we're already there, or we're already stepping into that maximizing mindset, be it on one example of what you see happening in an organization to, that wider impetus. I was doing a session with the FT just a couple of months ago. There's a huge collective of HR directors in the room, and we got into an interesting discussion around collaboration. And within that moment, it was wonderful, because to your point, Ryan, we were suddenly talking about what does collaboration mean in our business, and we're not actually talking about a generations problem or barriers or conflicts. We're actually talking about, how do we really give it more agency to collaboration within our company, and how do we unlock that and unleash that in two important respects, which is one, to better maximize individual potential, but also crucially that collective and collaborative potential. So the short line answer therefore, Ryan, is I see a definitive movement to something much more optimistic and really good and exciting things happening already. And also, finally, I think people very open and willing to share what they're doing with each other.
Yeah, fantastic. And I can already see a couple of responses coming through. There's some positivity, particularly around kind of personal views. Naturally, the kind of practitioners we are in our backgrounds, we are going to naturally see lots of opportunity potential here with this. but recognizing that there are some blockers internally, culturally, that we're going to need to navigate. And absolutely, today we'll touch on some practical kind of tips and takeaways and things that we can try to do to just change the feeling and some of the switching some of the mindsets when it comes to this conversation. So yeah, brilliant.
And I love that, Ryan. And I think, thank you again for the comments so far, because I think that also indicates, this is the community on this call that I'm really excited about, as in terms of reframing that narrative. Even if you're seeing and feeling it in certain respects within your organization or within your industry, this is what's exciting to us around, being those architects for change and positivity. We don't need to dwell in this in any respect, but I just think, as a bit of an anecdote, what is interesting over time, having really dug into sort of generational change and shifts, and I'm not, by the way, taking us back to Aristotle and ancient Greece, because we've been talking about generational change since ancient Greek, since the ancient Greeks and Romans, and there's nothing new under the sun there. But what is interesting, and I think it's an important one for us, because again, Alex Mann at Challenge Fall, they do a lot of work around Gen Z at the moment. I quote Alex in the book actually, because she said, we're living in an age of overclassification, and at some point it's hindering us more than it is helping us. And I think that's interesting around, I talk a lot about looking at our organizations through lenses rather than labels. And just as one helpful, again, I'm sure everyone's probably familiar on this call, but when we're dug into it, there is, first of all, no single official nomenclature origin for how we look about defining a new generation. They all come into being organically, often informed through different influences, through the wider context of our times, cultural, wider sociological, different shifts happening. Sometimes they're renamed partway through. I mean, the millennial generation actually took 2 or 3 different forms before it landed on millennial, and the same is true throughout history. So, but again, this might be helpful again as you're talking or indeed running surveys or looking at how you map your organization. And again, things that will be familiar to you, but feel free to use any of this that might be helpful as you're being the advocates and, again, architects of more positive conversations across your entire organizations, or indeed with others, because I'm sure, again, there's a lot of people on this call who are already setting your own standards, and we'd love to hear from you. I think just the final piece, wrapping up before we sort of get into a little bit more texture, and a couple of slides to come on what you alluded to next, Ryan, which was we love that, the number of people who signed up for this session was just really fascinating, and it energized me, because when I set out to write this book, as I said, for me, writing this book was also helping to answer a question: how will I have been part of the solution? And for me, that was to open source examples of the research that was true across the world, not just in business, in leading global business and national business, but family businesses of all shapes and sizes, in education, in government, and in social purpose. And you'll see this is just a number of examples of the case studies in the book. But again, I think the evidence shows that this is not indexing in any one industry over another. It's not true of any size or scale of industry. And importantly, the case studies are designed to be borrowed. I've always said you do not have to read all 55,000 words. If you read one case study or one chapter, what's exciting for me is that, go and borrow that work, go and get inspired to implement an idea in your organization, or indeed to pass it on. And as you said, Ryan, absolutely, there are challenges. And as a very top line to what showed up in the research behind the book, there are really 2 consistent buckets across. If I go back to this slide, all these examples and so many more, these are representative. But the 2 big areas are, where we have challenges, how well do we understand each other across our organization? What does that understanding look like? Where are we making perceptions? Where are we not even attracting talent into our organization for the first place? Because we're not opening the aperture up enough, or where are there constraints in our organizations to allow us to do so in terms of our roles and everyone on this call? That, of course, the other lens on understanding is what are the lenses through which we're looking at our organizations? Where are we sometimes held back, again, by systems and structures, or by budgets, or by lack of investment? And again, that's what's exciting around, I think we're probably going to get onto a bit more detail around what Ryan and I were talking about last week. We almost sort of see a bit of a reset coming in a good way around the future of work and what that means. And we won't dive into that more now because we want to open up your lenses on that. But what does that look like? So how do we need to map and matrix organizations differently? And how do we need to better understand that from the beginning? Second of all, of course, that goes hand in hand with communication, both within internal communications, but also external communications. And again, all of this hardwired is into everything from how we attract, motivate, retain talent, the flow of knowledge throughout our business, how we think about knowledge transfer, how we think about succession planning, how we think about engagement, how we also think about future products, services, and innovation. And again, this is where everyone on this call has such a vital role at the sort of beating heart of the center of the organization. But without these two really working hand in hand, what was consistent in the research, again through across the 5 generations at work and the generational diversity that's on the rise, is if we're not doing this, we're really missing out on maximizing that potential. So we'll close off there for now, because that really sort of gives a little bit of a top line flavor, because what was true, and it was borne out by everyone that we spoke with in the book. And by the way, what I love is that the youngest voice in the book is 80, the oldest is 80, and so very much true to the idea of we have 5 generations at work. But certainly to your point, Ryan, we heard loud and clear that everyone is beyond this discourse, where we've seen sort of headlines in the media telling us that everything is divisive, it's full of conflict, it's full of bias and stereotypes. A lot, there's such a groundswell now that we're past that, and actually we want to turn this into a bit of a maximizing moment around, this is fantastic, we have this greater generational diversity, we have more problems than we need in the world, but surely again, businesses have always risen up through constraint. The greatest brands, I'll share one. I don't know if it's on this, if you're on this call, but Lego was born in a depression. But so let's think about that, where we have constraints and things outside our control. This is a maximizing moment if we choose to actually seize that opportunity. So I'll pause there, Ryan, and hand over to you, as we'd love to open this out to all of you on the call and get your lenses.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be great to hear so that we can tailor some of the conversation and really understand how our audience today are talking about some of this stuff inside their organization. So we would love to hear from you in the chat. What is the biggest people problem or opportunity, if you're framing it that way, that you're currently solving for? What are the real big priorities? Give us a bit of an idea. And while we're waiting for some of that to come through, Rebecca, I think where we would like to get onto today is to just have a look at some of the myths or the stereotypes, the ways in which we're hearing. You've talked about the some of the narrative in the media, but actually, there are certainly some little anecdotes and things that I hear from organizations we work with about certain attitudes or perceptions that people might have of different generations. There are things that we're seeing come through in terms of some generational differences in terms of levels of engagement, levels of well-being. So it would be nice to kind of understand how our audience today is seeing some of this play out within their organization, but then actually just get into some of these myths and misconceptions as well. And is that, as we're waiting for people to send anything through in the chat around their biggest people problems, what are some of the biggest kind of myths and misperceptions that you've been hearing come through?
I mean, I think at a macro level, I think what is so disappointing and actually frustrating is when you continue to see, and I've seen it already into this year. I mapped enough of it over the past couple of years, and what finally informed the book. But articles with headlines that are incredibly divisive, articles or publications that are largely informed by almost pitting generations against each other, Ryan. So I think if we're seeing headlines or narratives that are around, which is the laziest generation, or frankly, sort of like quite throwaway framing of how we talk about each other, that's why again I have a real issue about being very careful about labels, and really thinking at a much, again, I use this phrase, sort of maximizing mindset. But yes, absolutely, there is difference, and that difference comes from the context of a Gen Zer and the way and that context through which a Gen Zer is born into the world, has grown up, in the same way that Gen Xer, Boomer, etc. And we've all grown up with different contexts, and that diversity and difference. I quote Toni Morrison in the book, whose Nobel Acceptance Prize. I find it continually and ever inspiring. She talks about meaning that's secured barriers, our difference, our human difference. And I think for me, this is about celebrating that human difference, but connecting it into the deeper meaning of our organization. That's why I love this question, Ryan, because it's really about, that individual linked to the wider collective and the wider potential. And that's where, again, we need to be very, very careful with these articles, surveys, and polls. Before we even go there, I think, let's just not engage. It's very clear to us all on this call, I'm sure, who is owning much more pragmatic and optimistic conversations about where we need to be, and where we're still, where others, I think, are still peddling problems and myths and things, frankly, that are holding us back. And we're in 2025. I'm sure every single one of us wants to be doing something a lot more meaningful with our careers rather than getting bogged down in this. And I think that's just one we'll close on. I mean, you'll see a ton of articles still talking about these traits and tropes of Gen Z being defined by as the generation that craves purpose-led careers. I don't doubt, and I don't know how many generations we've got on this call, but certainly through my experience and what I want to achieve in the world is it's deeply purpose-driven, it's deeply purpose-led, and there isn't a single person I meet with on a daily or weekly basis who disagrees with that. So I think we need to be really careful not to fall into some of these very generic and actually sort of quite throwaway traps, Ryan.
Yeah, I agree. And we've had some great responses coming through. So thank you for those who've contributed to the chat. Karen saying, big challenge for her and her organization is balancing future skills that they might need with how they maintain heritage skills and encourage people to retrain. Mm-hmm. We've got Lorna talking about succession planning and a clear succession gapping existing at the mid-career stage, needing to find a bridge gap there. We've got some other individuals talking about the fixed mindset, so linking to some of this stuff that we've just been chatting about. There's a couple of comments there around maybe negative attitude towards younger generations, some stereotyping around laziness or being more flakier. How do we attract and retain across all 5 generations is another comment. So first person to mention AI. So AI entering the world, how different generations see it, whether some see it as more of a challenge and where it creates anxiety versus others seeing it as more of an opportunity. And just understanding the different needs and expectations of people. So that point that you mentioned around understanding, creating that better and deeper understanding. So yeah, some real fantastic challenges coming through. So those individuals who contributed those, could I also just ask, as we continue in the conversation, as to what are you currently doing inside your organizations to try and solve for some of these? What kind of strategies, what approaches? Is there anything you're doing that's working that has helped you move the needle on some of these pieces that might offer some kind of tips and good practice to other people on the call? That'd be fantastic. But Rebecca, as you hear some of those themes, how do they kind of sit with you? Are they the common ones? What are your general reflections on that?
Well, first of all, again, I can't see all of the chats because I'm screen sharing at the moment. But I want to say, first of all, Karen, I love your framing, by the way, of the different, the fresh skills, the rising skills with heritage skills. I absolutely love that blend of tradition and innovation. Again, that shows up loud and strong in so much of the examples and the case studies in the book. Certainly succession planning. I think I love that point from Lorna. It's really interesting. One of the things that I've been a big believer in for a while, and so we think about the FTSE stats that came out just a few days ago when we look at diversity in the boardroom, there's a lot of progress being made. But I think one of my beliefs is when we think about succession planning in any respect, are we able to start early enough? I've been a proponent probably for the past 7-8 years now of a platform which is known as sometimes a next generation board, a shadow board. They really hadn't taken off in corporates until more recently. They'd been known a lot more in social purpose as youth advisory boards or youth councils. The reason I mentioned that regarding succession planning, what I'm seeing now is a lot more corporates engage with next generation boards because, of course, they're not a full serving board per se, but the idea is that we're able to accelerate and amplify talent earlier, really build a platform on which they can start to sort of get exposed to the types of skills you're going to engage with around boardroom discussions, but without the constraints and sort of added responsibilities. The Financial Times is one case study in the book, and they've actually hardwired their next generation board not through necessarily a sort of under 30s generational lens, but because they wanted to look at diversifying succession pathways, and that those pathways to leadership weren't where they needed to be. And so again, that next generation board, which was born back in well, back 5 years ago, I think now, has now really come into its own as a platform for succession planning. And again, the points around attracting, retaining, motivating talent across the spectrum, absolutely love that point, hear that loud and clear as well. And I think one thing that I see a lot actually is, again, I hear from clients a lot around, we have probably more problems around the extremities, so youngest and the oldest. And again, maybe interested to unpack some of that, but yeah, fantastic reflections.
Yeah, brilliant. And so coming through to the point around some of the the barriers to this, and so a few of the comments around understanding, deepening understanding the different needs and expectations, the wants, the needs, the motivations of different generations, and then also challenging some of the stereotypes. It would be good just to chat, Rebecca, a little bit about myth busting, but I think I'd also like to give some really clear kind of guidance and tips around how we can better use data and research to actually help tell some clearer stories and challenge some of the mindsets that we see inside organizations. But as part of that, do you think we lean in enough to the fact that, yes, the younger generations, certainly from our research and what we see, do tend to be less engaged on your traditional engagement survey? They do tend to score lower around questions relating to well-being. And there's a lot of research out there that shows that the younger generations, or Gen Z, are more likely to take more time off work than millennials, who are more likely to take time off than older generations. Do we lean enough into that and talk about why that might be the case, and going beyond, suggestions that they're lazy or flaky, or that they're not as resilient, which is the other one that I've heard before with some of the younger generations? And how do you use some of that data to actually reframe the conversation to make sure that people don't look at the negative of some of those common data points that we see inside organizations? Anything on that, Rebecca?
Oh, I was waiting for the chat to roll, Ryan.
Yes, no worries. As people kind of send things through, we're really, really keen to get your take on that, because the data is there. It shows that younger generations are often the least engaged on engagement surveys, lowest scoring around well-being. But how do we use that to actually stimulate more of a conversation around empathy and understanding the challenges, and actually also asking ourselves as whether it's actually a good thing that they're setting higher expectations or wanting kind of clear boundaries in work for how work shouldn't be impacting on their well-being and their lives outside of work, for example. What's your take on that, Rebecca?
Well, again, you and I talked about this, actually towards the end of last year also, and I think the context piece is really important on the one hand. So when we think about career starters rising into the workplace for the first time, also, again, if we go back to that COVID, not sort of generation per se, but, that joining work for the first time through an online and remote world for the most part. And to your point, how we were managing through a great time of constraints. So I think that, there's a bit of a chunk of years to sort of factor into this. That can be skewed if we're not careful. So I think, there are examples like this that, again, context is always really important. And also, what how work will evolve. That's a good thing, I think, in terms of, there are conversations to be had around ways of working, around pathways. I mean, all of this is under the remits that we've talked about, from how we attract, retain, motivate talent to how we plan for succession. And this is going to show up in exciting new ways, which is, for me, why I'm excited for, my mandate or wish really to CEOs and leadership teams is to almost do a bit of a reset in terms of everyone, the different types of roles on this call, from learning and development to HR teams, to how we look about engagement, to talent and reward, because this really is the beating heart of how we we unlock that potential in our workforces, but not just in our workforces? Because again, I think there's a huge misperception sometimes around why everyone on this call is so important, because without that highly engaged workforce, that workforce is connecting into a highly engaged 5-generational customer base, consumer base, and client base. And I think that for me is the golden nugget around the business case. So that's why for me, again, getting past some of these barriers is so important. And then the second piece I'll just add, and it's why I spent a long time working with family. I love working with family businesses for many reasons, but family businesses were really interesting, looking at those who were setting standards and leading the way in many cases, because one of the big principles that came through, and Mars was one example, but it came through a lot of the research, was the word mutuality. And I think this sense, Ryan, and I know that this is borne out through a lot of your work and research as well, which is how do we better meet each other where we're at? So because we have 5 generations in the workplace for the first time, doesn't simply mean to say that we have to, quadruple, quintuple the number of platforms and channels of communications. What it does mean to say is, through the lens of our organizational values and our purpose as a business, what is right for us, and where do we best meet each other where we're at? That's why, again, when you often see these misperceptions and the bias kick in of, it's often through skip generations. You don't see this necessarily in family businesses. There's a brilliant interview with the Pentland Group. So Pentland Group, as you probably well know, owns lifestyle brands such as Speedo, LS, Berghaus, et al. And what's really fascinating is the work they do very intentionally on themselves, not only through the family, but across the entire business. And Andy Rubin, who's chair of the Pentland Group, talks about brand relevance is how we connect across generations. And, so again, this all comes through this spirit of constantly learning with and from each other, and this spirit of mutuality, which again, I go back to this big case study with the family members of Mars, which was amazing to have the family members of the Mars business on record and talk to us about how they see, this moment in time for their business, and how that's hardwired through the total operating model as well. So for me, Ryan, I think one of the big watchwords, and I'd love to hear everyone's lenses on this, is that sense of mutuality.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a great comment has come through with Laura, just picking up on the points about surveys, but actually, hearing more anecdotally in the organization that individuals who are earlier in their career are more led by values and purpose than perhaps previous generations. And so therefore, thinking about the language we use, but also even questioning whether traditional measures of engagement are appropriate moving forward. And I think from my perspective, I think that's a really great talking point. And you used the word opportunity earlier. I think there's a huge opportunity for organizations to maybe not necessarily rip up the way they do employee research, but certainly evolve it. From historically, we've even talked about, engagement is a term that we've coined as practitioners. Nobody goes home after work and asks their loved ones whether they're engaged or disengaged. We talk about our experiences, the behaviors that we see at work, but we've gone down this route of shaping traditional surveys that give us the opportunity to externally benchmark. So we're all asking the same questions as organizations so that we can compare how we score to others. And what we've seen organizations get a lot of value from is dialing into their values a lot more, to Lorna's point, and actually asking people the behaviors that they're observing on a day-to-day basis, and actually having a look at how well certain values are actually being embedded. And what does that look like? How does that perception differ across all different demographics, including age, but also from things like career development, not necessarily just asking people on a scale of 1 to 5 how they would rate career development and progression opportunities, but asking people, what is it that you want from your career here? Do you want to just master skills within the role that you're in currently, or are you interested in learning more and developing within a different level or even a different part of an organization? Are you looking to develop your skills to ultimately then move somewhere else? We don't ask and get enough richness from the way in which we run our employee research to really truly understand what people in our organization want, what they value the most, what the blockers and the opportunities are to improve the colleague experience for everyone. And I think as well, the last thing I would say on the surveys is let's think about how we can help leaders and managers with this conversation. we've tried for years to go and show them with these traditional surveys, this is how our colleagues feel, this is how we compare to others, this is how different demographics vary. But why don't we ask more questions to individuals around what it is that they want from their manager? What does their manager do a great job of? What would they love to see their manager do more of? Help managers understand how to better manage different people from different, not just different generations, but different demographics within their team. Let's not put a score on everything. Let's actually make insight more actionable by helping people understand what it is that I could do as a leader of people from all different types of backgrounds that is ultimately going to make sure everyone has a great experience and unlocks their true potential while they're working here. And I think sometimes we've gotten our own way of doing that type of research by trying to ask these rigid, structured questions in the same manner as every other organizations running them. So that would be one reflection for myself to Lorna's point around surveys and how we can use employee research to change some of the narrative. And we've got a comment just come through there. David has done exactly that as part of the performance conversations and really thinking about and tapping in more to what people really want from their career. Any reflections from you, Rebecca, and some of the case studies that you've worked on as well as to whether organizations have done that to a really positive effect?
Yeah, they absolutely have. And I think actually I'd just probably just dwell on this summary rather than sort of going into, I'm just conscious of time and really keen to maximize Q&A time with everyone. And we've got a little bit more to share as well and a couple of polls, but I've probably summarized some commonalities of countless pragmatic examples. And I think there's a big one which is around what companies are doing to actually turn this notion of division or conflict and barriers into force multipliers. And I think first of all, that's being that lead voice in the organization, that we have this moment, let's stop with the conflict, stop with the division. This is a moment to turn this opportunity into force multipliers. It doesn't mean to say that's going to be necessarily full of easy things to do, but actually again choosing 2 or 3 levers that we can really start to either evolve, or maybe one of which we completely revolutionize. And that's a good thing, because I think again this cycle of too many projects. One of the things that came through loud and clear, and there was tons of research behind this, but also in every qualitative conversation and case study conversation that I had, was companies suffering also from this project and initiative overload. And that was having an adverse effect on a lot of generations. That was particularly probably more exacerbated with younger generations, especially career starters, those early in their career, around going into an organization for the first time and actually, great, we have all this stuff going on, all these amazing ERGs, these committees, these things that we can join, but actually here is my day job. What am I meant to prioritize? Help me prioritize. So that's my second point around, I think also if we can be the architects of shifting from attention, we're in this intention economy, aren't we, where constantly we see and read about this every day, again, just so much noise and so much proliferation. How can we be the ones who start to cut through this? We're not going to be able to do it day one, but I think there's something for me around what could we do in 3 months? What could we do in 6 months, by the end of the year, in 3 years' time? And really be the ones to actually sort of seed that with our CEOs and leadership teams. Actually, we need to have more intentionality. It's so easy sometimes, especially on the CEO. And of course, I'm saying on average is sort of 4 years. I think that CEO tenure is getting longer from a latest data point that I saw just the other week. But it's always been marked by that sense of, there is so much that needs to be under a given leadership team's aegis. And I think what's exciting about the HR and people community is that we've always been the true guardians of people, the true guardians of the workforce. And, without that, we don't have the lifeblood of an organization. So I think if we can be the voices of greater intentionality, this has never been more the moment. Third of all, silos and intersections. Again, Ryan, you've touched on that beautifully. But I think for me, if we think about the things that you're solving, and you've touched on already in business and in society and the world at large, they're all connected. So, but again, of course, in the same way that education isn't set up for interdisciplinary thinking, really our structures in our organizations hasn't been set up for that. So how can we be the architects of greater sort of bringing people together and really bringing these intersections together? And then finally, of course, 1, 2, 3. Again, if these things are true and we're creating more conditions for this is the business case to not just our leadership teams, our CEOs, to investors and otherwise. this is the sweet spot because we are really hitting that magic moment of connecting employee experience to consumer experience. And that's when the product surface innovation and ideation just literally lets rip. So that's, for me, this maximizing mindset is so vital to unlocking a lot of this. But I thought that might be helpful, Ryan, to summarize a number of the truths that are key and common patterns to, a lot of the research and the case studies in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've touched on a lot of these myth busting because we're fluid and reacting to some of the things that are coming in the chat as well as just following the flow of the conversation. But I think we've tackled into some of the myths and I think the way in which social media is, and sometimes the power behind some of these negative narratives and stereotypes. It's just really important as practitioners, isn't it, that we continue to do that. From a culture perspective and coming into this, I'd be really keen to get your steer on how do you balance then this conversation around generations and differences and almost the individualization that organizations need to go through to really better understand everybody in the workplace. How do you balance that with having enough of a focus on similarities? And what I mean by that is just the fundamental things that every human being wants from a workplace, connectedness, a sense of belonging, people want to be treated fairly and with respect. So how have you been navigating that with some organizations? So actually there's still just a real clear focus on getting the fundamentals of culture right, knowing that is going to ultimately make a place where people are going to want to work.
Well, I think, again, this is where everyone on this call, I think, is in such an exciting and important place at this point in time, because I always say, and we would all agree, I know that, our organizational values have always been our North Star. And again, at a time when, there are so many constraints in so many respects in terms of aspects of what we do, this is really a moment to really unleash the power of our organizational values, and almost, I think, to reconnect our organization into their true meaning. There are probably no more than 5 or 6. If I think about everyone on this call, if you reflect on your organizational values right now, 4, 5, 6 is a typical average. I think what's fascinating is when we get together across an organization and we start to reconnect ourselves to what those really mean and how they show up in the everyday. That's when you really hear conversations through the lenses of those 5 generations around what bonds and binds us, what we share. Going back to that point, Ryan, that I talked about earlier on, in terms of mutuality, what does that organizational value of collaboration mean to us? Well, there's so much that really bonds and binds us. There's so much also that motivates us. When I think about people on this call who have roles in terms of reward and recognition, how does that show up in our organization? That might be expressed in different ways to somebody starting their career for the first time, and the way in which their career is going to evolve over the course of their career versus somebody, who is, probably 20, 25 years in, and they may be looking at infinite next chapters, but at some very powerful and fundamental levels. This is, again, I think, going back to your point, Ryan, when we do see a lot of stats around lower levels of engagement with early career starters, there's huge context behind that. I think also that's, if we can meet people where we're at and have much more that mutuality, again, that mindset of mutuality, through which to, say to ourselves, look, this is why we come to work every day. This is why you chose to, apply to this company. This is why we have people who've been at our company for 10, 15, 20 years. Simply going back to that point of those challenges were the big buckets of understanding, communication, and without that, we're not able to maximize our individual and collective potential. So for me, this is, reconnect ourselves to those organizational values. Make sure also that leadership is fully connected into how they resonate and hardwired through the business strategy. They've never been words on a wall. We know that. That's our role and responsibility. What's difficult sometimes is when there are other forces outside our control, when you see that happening. So I think, again, where we can bring our organization together, open up conversations, have dialogues, do them through the lens of teams, business units, divisions, departments. But I think these are really agile and constructive ways in which we can bring people together who sometimes also would never have met in an organization. I hear that a lot. Simply bringing people together, being that catalyst of these conversations, with a bit going back to this notion of more intentionality, sort of less attention and more intentionality. We really start to get to hear all the time, Ryan, what bonds and binds us, what we share in so many respects across our organizations.
Yeah, agreed. And I think from my perspective, one of the things we often see with the research is, some of the younger generation's early careers is they don't feel like they really have a voice. So to your point about communication, that like two-way communication of really feeling listened to, are their views and their perspectives really as welcomed as they should be? Again, coming back to that opportunity, are we seeing it as organizations enough of an opportunity to actually get that fresh perspective, that challenge, as to, what we could do better, how we could improve things? And it's certainly something we see time and time again coming through the research. Some of the younger generations having the lowest perception of whether, their voice is really listened to, whether they have sufficient opportunities to express an opinion, and so on and so forth. So really a clear opportunity there for us to strengthen that. And I like your suggestion of how you could tap into that and the types of groups that you could set up to get some of those perceptions. Fab.
Sorry, I lost the connection for a bit there, Ryan, but I'm back.
No problem. Back to you. I was just talking about the difference in perceptions of younger generations feeling listened to and feeling like they have a voice as part of that, what's really driving them and what they, some of where their frustrations are. So I think your point around how you can facilitate that outside of just surveys and really have better conversations inside an organization is really powerful.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, again, I just wanted to throw up this tons of data in the book around where we see this evidence. I think, we know this is true again around the potential of the multi-generational workforce. This is borne out time and time again, that high-performing multi-generational workforces. And again, this is the business case right here to our CEOs and leadership teams around, we see upticks in productivity. One of the biggest issues in the UK at the moment is productivity and what that looks like. Again, we do not have time to be wasting time on conversations around conflict and barriers. It's not to say we don't acknowledge, where gaps exist, where bridges need to be made, or where more effective conversations need to be broached in organizations. But certainly stronger talent pipelines. How we again that came out earlier on in the chat. How we attract, retain, and motivate talent through to greater diversity of skills. Again, I love that point earlier on about how we retain that balance between introducing fresh skills, but also ensuring that our heritage skills. I do a lot of work in Japan where we've got 400 and 500-year-old family businesses that have carried on across generations. What is the secret sauce to that, and how have we done that? And for me, there's that interesting tension between tradition and innovation. So again, the rest is true. We don't need to go into it. But I think what's interesting, Ryan, again, this is one of, I've worked with the St. Gallen Symposium and Institute over a number of years, but this interesting data point and stats around the number of employees that would agree that multi-generational workforce is absolutely key to growth and success. But of course, the reality is, do we have the policies and programs in place to support that? So I think that's interesting around sort of how we explore that gap and, again, really turn that into an opportunity, which I think, again, as we just get into the final part, we really would like to open this out into a more constructive sort of conversation as we have so far with the amazing chats we've had. It goes back to lenses versus labels. We need to be very careful about getting sort of bogged down into the labeling of everything. It really comes down to how we better understand and communicate. So I think with that in mind, we'd just love to open it out. And again, we've got a couple of polls that we'd love to throw out and final questions to you. And I think then, Ryan, it's probably the final 5 minutes for open Q&A.
Absolutely.
So over to you, Ryan, on one of our, I think it's one of my favorite questions, but I love that we get to ask this today.
Absolutely. And the audience have teed us up for this perfectly, right? Because we've had quite a lot of kind of comments about values and purpose driven individuals and organizations. So it'd be great just to hear from our audience in terms of reflecting on their own organizational values. Which one speaks to you most around how you could unlock individual and collective potential? Which one of your values do you think there's most opportunity around to really help you unlock individual and collective potential?
And I know this is often a tough question because ostensibly those organizational values work together, but we were just really interested to know if there's, one or two that might be surfacing or that you really lean on heavily, going back to that conversation earlier.
So we've got Tracy says all three: ambitious, inclusive, and accountable.
Oh, I love that. Oh, they're
Ambitious,
great values, Tracy. Love that.
To learn and grow from Helen.
Beautiful.
Grow together is a great one that Lorna's shared that they have. Really like that. Grow together, actually putting that kind of
Lorna's on fire. So again, forgive me because I can't see the chat at the moment, but so thank you.
I'll read them out to you, don't worry. We've got respect and care from Judith.
Respect and care, brilliant, love that. That's really interesting, Judith, because respect, again, there's another thing around that point around mutuality. Mutual respect came up loud and clear from every generation that we spoke with around, what we need to, embed much more progressive work in organizations. So I love that respect is there in your organizational values. That's wonderful.
And David's contributed collaborative, authentic, respectful, and dynamic.
David, that is the word of the day, collaborative. I love that.
Talk to us a little bit about collaboration then, Rebecca, because I know it's something you're really passionate about, this word.
Yeah.
I would say it's probably, of all the different clients I've worked with over the years, and as you mentioned, the values being on the wall, it's probably one of the words that you see the most frequently. Completely. It's probably the one that comes up time and time again as being the least successfully embedded. So talk to us a bit about collaboration.
Yeah, and again, you frame that beautifully, Ryan, and it's so true. Again, if you map organizational values across the UK, but also far beyond that on a global basis. But there's a ton of UK studies and surveys, and also we feature some of that in the book as well. That collaboration does index in the top 5. Consistently, it is the highest scoring around when you're mapping which organizational values show up. But the reverse is true, is that it's often paradoxically the one that is least invested in. It's really under indexed. And I mean that in the sense of when you talk to organizations around, how does collaboration show up? How do you actively invest in that, both in sort of that everyday muscle, and that everyday muscle, I mean, such is that we don't even think about collaborating because it's just the way we work. It's just how we do things. It's just how we operate. So those simple mechanisms that bring our behaviors to life through to, of course, then collaboration that unlocks the extraordinary and innovation. And I think what I'll do, Ron, if that's okay, I'm just going to page on to, I'm going to come back to these questions, but just in terms of a case study. So this is a case study I just love to whip through in 2 minutes. And I love this case study because it was inspired by one individual in an organization of over 200,000. And instead of solving a problem for herself, she turned this into an opportunity for all and across the entire organization. Because the problem that she had was essentially she sort of 4 years into her career at the time, and she thought, well, it's time for me to do something new, do something else. So again, classic when we think about career talent and mobility and succession planning. And she thought, well, I work in this huge organization. There are 75 brands. So thinking about the people on this call and how your organizations are structured. So it's a large organization, highly articulated vertically, let's say. But she realized I didn't really know enough about what's happening in other parts of the organization around where I might go next. And so instead of saying, okay, I'm going to go perhaps move to another company, she dug in and she worked with, and I love sharing this part of the story with everyone on this call, because she worked with her people team and her learning team together to start having this conversation. Is this true? Do you see this a lot? Can we talk about this? And within quite a short space of time, it ended up with her writing a short business case and her own job description for this platform that became one of the most vital horizontals across the organization. And I think this is what's fascinating to me about collaboration. When we think about how our organizations are structured and what facilitates our ability to, again, understand each other, communicate with each other. And that's what this became. She launched a 365 platform, and it was an ongoing challenge around how everyone across the business could come together to solve real-time solutions that were sustainable in the sense of The company in question happens to be in largely in the fashion industry and the lifestyle industry, and so sustainability is a huge target in terms of its business strategy. So this wasn't just sort of theoretical challenges and going back to my issue about fewer projects and initiatives and more sustainable platforms for change, and that's what she put in place. And so people are coming together across the organization, collaborating across cultures, roles, brands, disciplines, generations, areas of expertise. But what was exciting to me, Ryan, is that this individual didn't start out with a generations problem, right? She said, actually, I recognize that we have a bit of a collaboration problem because we simply don't know enough about each other in this entire portfolio. And so, of course, what she did was preciously connect that consumer experience to the employee experience to consumer experience. I'll reveal who that company is now for anyone in the luxury or fashion industry on this call, but it's LVMH, which, as we know, owns everything from Vuitton to Dior to Sephora and many other brands. Importantly, this platform is living and thriving today, launched just before COVID. The acronym DARE stands for Disrupt, Act, and Risk to be an entrepreneur. And that's why I was so intrigued to hear about your organizational values and what is motivating and driving your people, because this was set up, and the language I think is so important to that. It was a call to action to everybody, not hierarchical, but that call to action for us to come together as individuals and collectives. And it was a recognition, to your point, Ryan, that collaboration is difficult. It's not easy, but it was and the proof is that this has now become an open platform for innovation, not only within the company, but also with partners and stakeholders. So again, for me, this is a classic case in point where actually a little muscle goes a long way that can reach across an entire organization, but that muscle world shouldn't be underestimated, because again, this is a great example of how you take collaboration as an abstract off a page and really infuse it into the beating heart of an organization.
Fantastic, Rebecca. I think we've got a few minutes left. If there's any of the audience have a specific question that they would like to put to Rebecca, that would be great. But whilst they're doing that and sending that through, I think it's always useful to try and, you alluded to this at the beginning, we're trying to do so much as practitioners. Always, there's so many different things for us to try and do, different challenges we're trying to navigate. What would you see as being kind of one really practical takeaway for anyone here today as to how they could just elevate some of the conversation, some of the work that they're trying to do in this area? Maybe it is around how to stimulate better conversations around the values, rethinking, research methodology to how well we understand the extent to which those values are embedded in our culture. Or maybe it's something else, Rebecca. What would you kind of say is the number one kind of really practical step people can take to try and...
I think there's a couple of things. I think I'll go back to the very first question that we asked. What are the biggest problems that you are solving for and the opportunities in terms of people, problems and opportunities in your organization? And really hardwire that to some of the things that we talked about. And I think crucially, this is where the second part is, which I believe so importantly, and I see it every day, that HR practitioners and across the entire remit, right? Learning, reward, recognition, the entire remit, it's huge. We are the catalyst for change. And I think it's our moment in time also to really interrogate the why, when more things are coming our way, in a good way. Sometimes that might mean saying no or not now, because going back to those tension points around, silos to intersections, from attention to intention, this really is about, we are the crux of that. And what I see is actually, again, this momentum around much more sort of reframing of conversations, again, around doing fewer things well and sustaining them. I mean, think for me, I love to come off a session and think about what is one thing I could do today, and might be that one thing might be owning that narrative to say, if you're ever hearing more divisive conversations in your organization around this, really that you own that narrative now. You are absolutely that catalyst for a much more hopeful and pragmatic and positive, wherever that's coming from. That might be coming from somebody who's joined your organization this week to the CEO, but you are the voices of that change. Second of all, what can you do in the next 3 to 6 months? That might be something you can do with your team. It might be something you can do with a business unit, or something that is a really gnarly problem, but you can see really potential there for change over time. And then the third thing is, what is happening in the business, going back to the problems that we're solving for. Again, I think we really need to hardwire that. The best HR practitioners, as the catalyst for change, always hardwire this into the business strategy. And so don't take no from the boardroom or from the CEOs if you see that potential for change over the long term. There are countless examples of the book of how this has proven true. And again, going back to that point, often these are inspired by perhaps one individual or a small collective. So as I say, I love working with this community on this call, because this is the crucible of opportunity. This is the crucible of unlocking the absolute potential of our business, both individually and collectively. And I think in 2025, when we think about the force factors upon us and what is outside of our control, I always say, the greatest brands have grown strong through constraint. And whatever time this might be called, we're talking about this as the age of AI at the moment. I'd actually like to think, Ryan, I know you and I have talked about this before, surely this is better than the age of AI. This is some form of new renaissance when we'll see this melting pot of tradition, innovation, science and art, human and tech coming together as never before. But it won't do it unless we do it. And I guess the final word is to Einstein, a quote from Einstein that traveled with me in writing the book, that and he saw this many years ago, he predicted we'll be at a quantum leap in tech, we'll need a quantum leap in human relations, and we are the quantum human. So all credit to
Absolutely.
everyone on the call today for being the quantum human.